In this video, we will be starting the Chapter 8 app and installing the Django REST framework. Now, in your project, you can create a new Chapter 8 app by right-clicking the Becoming a Django Dev folder and selecting Add and Django App and typing in all lowercase letters chapter_8. And when doing so in your Chapter 8 apps.py file, go ahead and update the name variable to reference the Python dot notation pointing to the folder path where your Chapter 8 app was installed. And in your settings.py file, go ahead and activate the Chapter 8 app at this time. And as well in your main urls.py file, go ahead and make sure every previous chapter has been commented out and include a path, the include path to your Chapter 8 urls.py file, where we will be putting our URL patterns for this chapter. Now, for the Django REST framework to work, and for the examples that we're going to use throughout this chapter, we need to make sure the Django REST framework package is installed, as well as the Markdown and Django filter packages. From your console window, as long as your virtual environment is activated, as you can see mine is here, you can do a pip install Django REST framework, and mine's already going to be installed, but if it wasn't right now, it would have actually installed that. The same goes for Markdown and Django filter. And once that is done, in your settings.py file, we need to configure a few things in here in order for this to work. The first being in the installed apps. Where is that? Yeah. In the installed apps, under what I have in the code of this book, Django apps, actually they're in the third-party apps. I placed the REST framework, and we will also need REST framework auth token. Now, bare minimum, this first one is all you need, but for some of the exercises throughout this chapter, towards the end of this chapter actually, we're going to be using this particular app right here. So it would be fine if you just installed both of them right now. And next we will need to create a REST framework, which is towards the bottom of this file. Here we need to define a default permission class. And the one that we're going to be working with now is the Django model permissions, or anonymous read only. And it's spelled anon read only. You can also configure right now, we're not going to use them in some of our first examples within this chapter, but it's okay if you installed this now because we will use these later. The authentication, default authentication classes, and here I've preloaded the token authentication and session authentication. Now, in our chapter 8 urls.py file. If you don't have one at this time, go ahead and create one within this directory. Here we're going to import the Django contrib admin library, and we'll also be using the include and path functions from the Django URLs library. We'll continue to work with the template view class found in the Django views generic library, and by default in all of my chapters of the code of this book, I've created a home page for the chapter that we are working on. This is duplicated from an earlier chapter and just updated any reference to chapter 8. And I am activating the admin path, or the Django admin site. This was discussed earlier in chapter 6, and it's not required to actually install and use the Django REST framework. However, for a lot of the exercises we'll be doing in this chapter, this is needed, and this is why we are preparing our environment for this at this time. Now, the one path that you do need to add in order to make sure the Django REST framework works in your project is this API auth path that you see here. Now, you can name it anything you want. It doesn't have to actually be API-auth, but whatever it is, you need to include the REST framework URLs, and that's Python dot notation, so it's looking for the urls.py file within the REST framework library that we are referencing, so you don't actually have to import that. Now, the rest of these paths that you see here, they're not actually needed at this time, so you can either comment these out, or if they're there, it doesn't matter either. We'll be getting into those later within this chapter. Now, that pretty much concludes installing the Django REST framework and making sure that it works, that it's installed. One thing we can do is go to our make sure that our project is running. And here you can also see that when we install the REST framework, it's going to create, it's going to add migrations for us. And so what we need to do is break out of this, and if we run make migrations, it shouldn't actually make anything at this time. No changes detected, because what that does is it detects any changes within code that you write, but the 3 unapplied migrations are because there are migrations that exist within the REST framework package, or the REST framework auth package, that auth token package that we also installed. So by executing the migrate command now, what we will do is run these migrations. And that installed 3 migrations from the auth token. So if we go back to our settings.py file, and we look at the REST framework.auth token application that we installed into our project, that's the reason why it is now picking up these 3 migrations. So that now reflects within our database. If we go back to pgadmin and right click our tables and hit refresh, we'll see that we now have another table that is the auth token table. And 3 migrations pertain to 3 changes that have occurred to this one table. Going back to our project, we're going to load the home page. And it might help if we actually run our project for this. And now we can see we've got the Chapter 8 homepage. And I'm going to do /auth API auth. Which we have nothing at this time. But that concludes installing the Django REST framework, and we'll move on to the next video. In this video, we're going to start serializing objects and linking them to viewSet classes and wiring up URL routers within our Chapter 8 urls.py file. And then in the next video, we will look at this using the Browsable API and learning about what that is. So to begin working with serializing a model object, which means to convert a model object into JSON format to represent the data of that object, specifically something that was looked up within our database and is now either a single object or a query set of objects. So in our Chapter 8 directory, let's go ahead and create a file called serializers.py. And it's inside here where we will be doing most of our work. We are going to import a class called model serializer from the REST framework.serializers library. And another one that we'll begin working with later is the hyperlinked model serializer class. And from our Chapter 3 models.py file, let's go ahead and import all the seller, vehicle, engine, and vehicle model classes that we created earlier in Chapter 3. And let's go ahead and create 4 different classes. One called engine serializer, another called vehicle model serializer, another called vehicle serializer, and another called seller serializer, like the ones that you see here. And they will all inherit the model serializer class that we imported, and they will all consist of a meta subclass, similar to how we've used meta subclasses before elsewhere in forms or in models. We'll define the model option and link it to the specific model that pertains to the name of that serializer. So for instance, vehicle serializer will link to the vehicle model. And for the fields, let's just use __all__ for all 4 of these classes. Now we can begin building our viewSet classes, and these are views that are going to serve up the information that we're retrieving and serializing. So in our Chapter 8 views.py file, we need to import from the REST framework user.permissions library. The isAuthenticated class. And from the REST Framework ViewSets library, we need to import the model ViewSet class. And then from the serializers file that we just created, go ahead and import the 4 classes that we just created. In the code of this book, I've also provided group, permissions, and content type serializers. You shouldn't need those at this time, but if you did give your user any type of groups or permissions, then you might end up wanting to use these. But the Chapter 3 fixture that was provided in this book, the one seller that we're going to use in these examples, does not have any groups or permissions assigned to them. So now we will create 4 ViewSet classes that pertain to the names of each of the models that we created, and they're going to inherit the model ViewSet class. So for instance, engine ViewSet will link to the engine class, and that's what we're using to look up this query set here. So we're just going to grab all of the objects that exist in our database, and we're going to order them by the name field in ascending order, so from A to Z. And our serializer class is an option we give it to link to the serializer that we just created in that serializers.py file. And for each of these, give the permission class the isAuthenticated class that we imported from the REST Framework Permissions library. So do that for all 4 of them, and some of them aren't going to have a name field, such as the vehicle, so we can order that by price. And the seller, I am not ordering by anything. I'm just grabbing all the sellers. In this particular one, if all you have is the data that was provided in the fixture, then you should only have 1 seller at this time, but your results may vary. Now in our Chapter 8 urls.py file, this is where we are going to build out our routers. And in order to do that, we need to import the routers library from the REST Framework library. And also the 4 ViewSet classes that we just created, import them from our Chapter 8 views.py file. And then we create this router object, this which equals routers.defaultRouter, and then we register within that each of the view sets to a particular path that we created. So this would be /engines, /sellers, /vehicles, and /vehicle-models, and link them to each of the ViewSet classes that we just created. And again, if you're moving forward with the groups or permissions, that would be here. The user would be if in Chapter 3 we did not change our settings, which is here, the auth, the user model. If we didn't actually define this earlier in Chapter 3 to equal the seller model, then what you would want to do is define a user view set like we did here. So that is why that example is provided with this book. And then down here, we're going to create a new path / chapter -8. So if we wanted to view the engines, it would be / chapter 8 / engines to get to that. And we're just including all of the router URLs that we registered within this router object here. And that one path then, combined with all these routers that we created, handles all of the URLs that Django is going to soon create for us. And do make sure that the API auth endpoint is here. And so in the next video, we will demonstrate this in action using the Browsable API. In this video, we'll begin using the Browsable API, which is a built-in tool in the Django REST framework that will allow us for easy browsing and testing of our API endpoints. And looking at the Django REST framework.org website, where you can find all the information about the Django REST framework. And rumor might have it that it will be one day included in Django itself, but I'm not sure when that's going to happen. Just rumor has it that discussions are being made to maybe one day put that in the Django framework directly. But from here, from their website, you can go to Topics and select the Browsable API. And here you can learn more about what the Browsable API is and how you could even customize it. Now, from our project, in the last video, we registered routers for 4 URL paths: the engines, sellers, vehicles, and vehicle models that you see here. And we included that on the chapter 8 path that we created here, where we're including our router.urls. So because of that, making sure our project is still running, going back to our home page, we will go to the chapter 8 URL. And here we'll have the API root of anything that we created within that router right here. So this is where we see the engine, sellers, vehicles, and vehicle models. And it's going to provide a link to that specific path that you see here. So then when we click on one of them, we'll see it brings us to a new page. It's no longer the API root. This one is the engine list. But it is telling us that authentication credentials were not provided. So going back to our code in the views.py file, where we created our engine view set, we gave the isAuthenticated class to the permission classes that we're loading. That means that the Django REST framework is going to look for a session where the user is already logged into the Django admin site, so / admin, which is also the path that we defined here. So if we named it something else, it would be / something else. So let's go ahead and log in with our super user at this time, the one that was provided with the chapter 3 fixtures of the book. And now that I'm actually logged in, I'm going to go back to the same tab where we have our chapter 8 engines and refresh the page to now see that instead of a doorway that says access denied, I now get information, and this is the 2 objects that exist in the Chapter 3 data fixture. Those are vehicle models, Chapter 3 engine, and we see we've got only 2 of those that we defined here. And these are the exact same 2 that we see here. So now to go back to something that we did when we were serializing our objects in the previous video, in our views.py file, actually our serializers.py file, we used the model serializer versus the hyperlinked model serializer. So if we go ahead and uncomment this line out and comment the other one, basically swapping those classes out, let's go ahead and refresh this page and see what happens. So now you can see the primary key was replaced with now something called URL, which points to the actual detail page of that object. And then the related object, the vehicle model, it will point to the ID of that, the actual path to that detail page itself. So if you clicked on any one of these, it would take you to that actual instance. So let's go back and let's try this on the sellers. So when we click on the sellers, we'll see that the vehicles is a big list of numbers that tells us not a whole lot at this time. So here we're going to change that to a hyperlinked serializer. Notice we can't click on it before. And now we have a bunch of links that we can click to, which really makes this an easy way to navigate the Browsable API. So looks like number 7 was the example I clicked on in the book, where we have a vehicle instance. And also note for the seller that I'm excluding the groups and user permissions. And if you did want to fiddle around with those serializers, you would have to remove this statement as well. But let's go back. It's actually ID number 1 is the one I clicked on. And so it's on this page, the actual instance page, where if you select the raw data, you could conduct put and patch operations. But if you used only the HTML form, you would do put operations only. But here it is a little bit easier to view the vehicles that relate to it, and just all around a little bit easier to use a form. And at the top of the page, we can change our format from JSON to API. And we could delete the object from here as well. And options gives us a list of different options that you can perform. And so that concludes using the Browsable API and browsing through our default root API endpoints that we registered within our specific project. In this video, we'll be working with our first demonstration called building single page app like pages. And to begin with this, we'll be creating the views first. And so in our chapter 8 views.py file, we will have to make sure that we have two main imports, and that is our template response class and the view class we will need for these examples. And what we will be building is a get seller view class, which uses that view class that we imported. And here we're defining the template name, and this is going to be a file that we will be creating in our chapter 8 spa pages folder called getseller.html. And then we'll be using at least a get method for this view. And in here we want to at least load up some context. In this particular example, we're not actually giving it any context, but we are defining a blank variable to be used in the return of our template response. And here we load the request and our specifying the path of the template we're using, and then the context, which right now is nothing. And now to build the template, let's go ahead and make sure in your chapter 8, your templates, chapter 8 templates, chapter 8 folder, that you did create a spa pages folder and create that getseller.html file. From one of the previous chapters, I believe it was chapter 4, we worked on creating a file called base template 1. Go ahead and import that file and any of the related files that brings in into your templates chapter 8 folder so that they could be used with this file, since we are actually extending it. And so I just renamed the location from chapter 4 to chapter 8 since I copied that in here. Theoretically, you don't have to actually copy that. You could just point to the chapter 4 file. Next, we'll want to at least give a body content block, and that body content is being defined in that base template 1 file. Here we're going to just construct a very simple form, and the structure that we are giving that form is provided right here. We do need at least this input file, this input field, because we want to capture from the user a value, and then we're going to use that value to actually look up the information through our API request. And for that, we also need a button. And instead of a type submit, which would automatically submit the form, we're going to make this a type button, because we are going to use JavaScript to mimic how this form actually behaves. And so we won't be triggering a post request at all. Instead, the page isn't going to navigate anywhere, it isn't going to post. Instead, the JavaScript is just going to perform a fetch operation, and it's going to take that information that it gets in return and place it inside of this details container that we're creating. So essentially it will delete this paragraph and replace it with whatever it gets. And so for that, what we do have to do is inside of our Chapter 8 base template 1 file, you will see that in debug mode, so while we're running this locally, because debug is turned on when we run it locally, we are serving up the Chapter 8 JS site.js.js file. And it's inside this file, located here, that we are going to create our go-to spa page function. And this function is actually triggered here on the onClick event of our button that we created. And so when that function gets triggered, we do need to create these 3 constants. And the container constant is pointing to the details container. This is the container in which we want to actually dump the information into. And then the input constant is the input field that we want to capture that value from the user. And so that's this input field here. And then the ID constant is simply the value of this input constant, or the input field. And then we need a API endpoint for which we want the actual fetch operation to perform on. And for that, this is the Chapter 8 sellers endpoint, where we're actually specifying an ID number. And that URL was created using this sellers router, in which we're actually tying into the seller view set, which utilizes the seller serializer that we have here. And so for the rest of this function, we do need to specify the fetch operation, in which you see here. We need to at least specify the method and the headers of this, this function. And we're going to specify a get method and the content type as application JSON. And then here we have 2 promises being returned to us. And the first one is simply just going to return the response as JSON. And then the second promise is going to stringify that data and then dump it into the container, into the inner HTML of that container constant, in which is the details div that we've created here. And then the last thing we need to do is actually map this URL. And so for that, you need to create this path in your Chapter 8 urls.py file. We're specifying it just as Chapter 8, chapter-8 /get seller. And here we're going to point to the get seller view that we just created. Make sure you specify that class as view. And then this technically isn't mandatory, but it is good practice to always include a name attribute to your paths. And so now go ahead and make sure that your project is running, as mine is here. And it is still running here. So now we can navigate to the Chapter 8 Get Seller page. And here you'll see just a very basic page, no special formatting. We see that the information that is depicted inside of this div container, or this details container, is the no details to display paragraph that we put in there. So then we know if everything is working properly, that message will disappear and be replaced with whatever we have to replace it with. So now I'm going to type in just the ID of number 1. If you loaded the fixture provided in Chapter 3, there is at least one seller included in that fixture. And so you'll at least have an ID number 1 in your database. If you've created other sellers, then you can look up that ID as well. But if you didn't create any other sellers, then you would just get nothing in return, which is what happened with the number 2. So if I enter the number 1, actually, if you enter in an ID that isn't found, you'll get details not found. I hit the enter button, which is a separate action from an on-click event. So the number 1, which is in the database, will return an actual JSON output. And here, if you were using a JavaScript-based framework, you would style the HTML and the CSS as you need fit. This is just raw data right here. And so it's an extra layer of complexity in order to actually finish this page. But also to depict what the serializer is doing, you'll see that right here we do have the hyperlinked model serializer enabled. And that is why we were getting the URL in the data that was returned. So if I turn it back to the model serializer here, this URL that I was referring to, which actually points to the actual seller 1, found here. Not sure why that took so long to load. Sometimes it does that locally, sometimes it doesn't. But now if we, I don't even need to reload this page because what I did was edited a .py file, not anything that requires the browser to actually refresh. So if I just hit this again, I will get the non-hyperlinked version of this ID, and it's just the number 1. So we don't actually have a URL that's printed. The same applies to the vehicles that we see under this seller. So yeah, just keep that in mind if that is important when you are serving up data that's being returned. And that concludes the first demonstration on how to build a single page app like page, otherwise known as a spa-like page. In this video, we're going to modify the first demonstration for the optional asynchronous example. And so for that, all we have to do is go back to our site.js file where we have our go-to-spa page function. And it's on here that we are going to instead of use the promise where it's dot then response, we're going to use then async response. And then we're also going to replace return response.json with return await response.json. And also in the second promise where we have .then data, we'll use .then async data. And we'll comment out the container.innerHTML JSON.stringify function. Instead, we'll want to create a new constant called this data, where it equals await data, and then create a new container.innerHTML operation where we're basically using the same thing. And except we're using this data instead of data. And that's all that we have to replace in order to make this an asynchronous function. Now back to our get seller page, we'll just we'll reload this page and watch that it still functions the way that it should, except it's doing it asynchronously in the background now. And that concludes this demonstration. In this video, we'll be creating our own custom API endpoints. And in this particular example, we'll be returning pre-formatted HTML instead of a JSON object. And this is not typically how API endpoints work, but this is one way to demonstrate the extra power that Django does provide. If you wanted to return just a simple JSON object, you would return that instead of the formatted HTML that we're going to return, which will also be demonstrated in the third demo. And so for this example, we will need the Django shortcuts library render function. So import that with this statement here. You will have to import the chapter 3 models seller object. We are going to need the isAuthenticated class provided by the REST framework permissions library. And we will need the API view class provided by the REST framework views library. And so in this file, we are going to create a new class called getSellerHTMLView. And here we're going to use the API view instead of the view class that we used for the last example. And that is because we are turning this into our own API endpoint. And so for here, we do want to make sure that we're specifying a permissions classes, and we're passing in the isAuthenticated class. This is a list, so you could use additional permissions classes. In this particular example, we're only using one of them. And we're specifying the template name of and this is where we're going to put the HTML that we want pre-formatted. And that's going to be our chapter 8 details seller.html file. And for this API endpoint, we're only going to specify the get method. And we will have to inject the ID when we're initializing it, And for this particular example, we will have to set format equals none. That's in the documentation provided for this API view class. Here we check to see if the request user is authenticated, and if that user actually has the permissions to view the seller object provided in the Chapter 3 app. And so this is where you go in Chapter 6, when we learned how to go into the admin panel and adjust either group or user level permissions for each of the users within your system. And so that has permissions is checking to see if that particular permission is granted. And so if the user is logged in and has those permissions, then we're going to try to look up the seller object with the ID that's provided. And then if the seller is not found, we set seller to a none. Here we format the context that we want to send into the template that we're rendering, and we're going to pass in the seller object that we found. And here we just return a simple render and pass in the request, specify the template name, and pass in the context. And now to build the template, in our Chapter 8 details folder, within our templates folder, we'll see the seller.html file provided with the code in this book. Go ahead and create this file within your project in the same directory and add the code that you see here, where we are not specifying any of the HTML as in a full page, where we have our doc type, our head tag, and our body tags. So none of that exists because this is technically a partial file of a website. And so here we're only going to provide the HTML that we want included inside the details container. So everything from here will exist within this file. And so here we use the seller object that we passed in as context to specify these variables here, where we're formatting the name as an H2 label, the business name as an H3 label. If the seller does have any vehicles, we're going to iterate through that entire list of vehicles and print at least the name. And when looping through a query set within your template file, always make sure to use the all tag after you specify the name of that query set. And then if no seller is found, we'll print out a no seller to display message, or you don't have permission, because that is also part of the parameters within that view, is to check to see if they have permission. And so then we do have to modify the JavaScript that we had before. Here we're going to make sure we comment out the Chapter 8 sellers endpoint that we had before. And this time we're going to use, instead of a plural sellers, we're going to use a singular seller, so without the S at the end. So Chapter 8 seller and then the ID. and make sure these are backticks and not single quotes. And then we'll just comment out the first fetch example that we had. And in this fetch example, in this fetch operation, we're still going to specify the method and the headers exactly the same as before, where the method is get and the content type is application JSON. It will still consist of two promises in return. The first promise will return the response.text, and the second promise will fill the inner container with the data that was returned. And so we could see that in this example, it's using the same asynchronous example that we did in the prior demonstration. Except there is one difference in our container.inner HTML statement. Instead of JSON stringify, we're just printing the data raw. And then our final step for this demonstration is going to map the new URL pattern, and that is this endpoint that we're referring to here. So we do have to create that in our chapter 8 urls.py file. And here we're going to specify a new path called chapter 8 seller, the singular without the S. And we're listening for a an ID as the path that we're using. So here we are importing the getSeller HTML view that we just created, and we're still specifying a name attribute for best practice. So now if we make sure that our project is running, and we can go back to the same getSeller page as before, we do need to make sure that we are logged into our admin panel at this time. And here we can look up the seller ID of 1. And here what gets returned is now the pre-formatted HTML that we specified in that file, and exactly the structure that we specified. And if we were logged out of the system and then tried to search for an object, it would say that our credentials were not provided. That's because it's actually looking for a user who is logged in. And that concludes the second demonstration of how to write a custom endpoint. In this video, we're going to create a new custom API endpoint where we are authenticating with tokens in order to get a successful response. And this time, instead of creating a response that returns formatted HTML, we will be returning standard JSON objects, which is typically how API endpoints work. And to begin with this, we do need to go into our settings.py file. And this is where we want to make sure that we have the REST framework.auth token application installed in our project. I believe I mentioned that in an earlier video. And then here is actually where we're going to use the default authentication classes. And this is where you're going to want to bring in the token authentication and the session authentication classes to use within your project. And then the next thing we want to do is navigate to our administration panel. Make sure you are logged in with your super user account or the seller that has been provided with the code of this book. And then we're going to go to sellers and add. And one thing to note on here is back in, what was it, chapter 6. Back in chapter 6, admin.py, where we wrote our seller admin, do make sure that you're using the user admin class and not the model admin class example. Our field sets and our add field sets, make sure they are the values depicted here, particularly the add field sets. You'll note password 1 and password 2, which are not objects that we originally created for this, but that is inheriting it from the standard Django user admin. Make sure you turn off our examples where we demonstrated the get form method. And the reason why is I will uncomment it here. In this example, we went as far as creating the logic that actually points to one of 3 different forms that are being used. So either a standard seller form or a seller with super user abilities, or the add seller form if no object exists at all. In that particular example, we did not take it a step further because we didn't have enough room in the book to include how to wire up the missing password 1 and password 2 fields that came with the standard user model within Django. And so if you didn't comment this out and went to the add seller page, you would likely see an error like this. But if we comment that out and we don't use that for this exercise, then what we will do is pick up the get form method that exists within the user admin class, and that already includes all of the logic that we need in order to work with the password authentication system. So here, go ahead and create a new user. I'm going to call this one test. And then here we can also add some seller vehicles. And I'm going to add another. And we'll do a third one. And so we have successfully created the seller. Notice that after we created the seller, additional fields become visible. Here we want to make sure we give this user staff status, but not super user status. And for the user permissions, we need to provide the Chapter 3 seller can view permission. So make sure that this particular permission does appear in your chosen user permissions table. And then go ahead and save it one more time. So now we can see that the new user that we created does now appear in the system. The next thing we want to do is go into our tokens. And this is provided by the Django REST framework. And so here we'll add a token. And for the user, select the user that you just created. In this case, it's the test user. And I will save it. And here it gives you the token that it just created. Go ahead and copy that to your clipboard. The alternative to that would be to use this Python manage.py drf underscore create underscore token, and then space and the name of the user that you wanted to create the token for. And if you did that, it would print out the token for you. And then again, copy that to your clipboard. In this case, I'm going to skip that because I did it through the admin panel. And so I'm just going to make sure my project's running again. So now that we created that preliminary work, let's go ahead and create the view that we will need for this exercise. So in here, in your Chapter 8 views.py file, go ahead and make sure you have the JSON response class imported from the Django.http library. Include the isAuthenticated class from the REST Framework Permissions library. The API view class from the REST Framework Views library. The seller serializer class that we created in our Chapter 8 serials.py file. And in our Chapter 3 models.py file, bring in your seller class. And so here we're going to create a new class called getSeller with token view. And we're going to use the API view similar to what we did in the second demonstration. Again, we're going to use the permission classes, just the isAuthenticated class, just like in the second demonstration. And we're going to use a get method that is also written the same way as the second demonstration. And then here we're going to start off our seller as none, and then create a variable for our request user. And this is how we would grab that user from the request. And then we want to check to see if that user has the permission to view the Chapter 3 seller model. And if that is true, then we try to look up the seller. And again, if the seller is not found, the seller will equal none. And then our perm granted, this is just an extra variable that we're passing in to practice passing in variables into the context. This would kind of be redundant in a real world situation, because if you do get data back, that pretty much implies that you do have permission to view. This is just for practice. So here we do create context with the request, and we pass in the seller that we looked up. Here we serialize the seller object, and then we create a new set of context, and we return that as a JSON response. And then since we are returning JSON, we're not actually going to build a template file. So this template name is not actually required for this class, the way that we are using this. But we do have to modify our site JS file, where in our go to spa page function that we wrote, we will be commenting out the previous URL variable. This time we're going to specify that endpoint to be Chapter 8 seller token and the ID that we wish to look up. And that's the ID of the seller that we want to look up. So go ahead and comment out the fetch function from the previous demonstration, and this time we're going to write a fetch function that matches the code that you see here, where we're still using a get method. The content type is still application JSON. However, we are passing in two new parameters into this header, and that's the user and authorization. The user would be the name of the user you just created. In my case, it is test. And then capitalize token and space and the actual token. So here I'm going to paste in the token that was just created, which is actually this. The one that was there was from my previous attempt before recording this video. So you can see A3EA are the last four, and A3EA are the last four of this one. So in a real world scenario, this would be extremely bad practice to hard code a token into the code like this. Instead, you would want to perform a fetch function right around here on line 67, where you have a separate view. And again, there wasn't enough room in this chapter to go this deep into this, but we provided this example assuming you've already received the token, but here you would create that first fetch function operation that points to a view that you created that creates a token on the fly, and that token can exist forever or it can be destroyed after X amount of time, and then returns that token to you, and then you use that token as a variable to inject into the second fetch function that you see here, to then perform the operation that then looks up the user, or the seller I should say, at this particular endpoint, the Chapter 3 seller token endpoint. So assuming that we've already gotten the token back, here we would inject the token into this header, and then we would have two promises again, and the first one just returns the response, and the second one takes that data that we got in return and puts it into the container as inner HTML. And again, that container is the details divider that we created on our getSeller.html page right here. And then the last thing we need to do is map the URL pattern. So in your Chapter 8 urls.py file, we will be creating that new path for Chapter 8 seller token. Here we'll be importing the getSeller with token view class and use it as view. And again, for best practice, we're going to specify a name parameter. And so for this example, you'll see that in this browser I'm logged in as my admin user, which is the seller that was provided with the Chapter 3 fixture, that super user. So in a new incognito window, make sure that you're not logged in at all. And so one way you could find out is if you go to /admin from your local host, and it's asking you to log in with the username and password, you know that you're not logged in at this time. So then in a new tab, you could go to the Chapter 8 getSeller page. And once this page is loaded, we'll go ahead and enter in 1 and look up the seller with ID number 1 and see that we did get a JSON object in return. And an example of how that token actually works: if you were to modify this token in any way to be an incorrect token, as in this token does not exist in your system, and since we're modifying JavaScript this time, we do have to actually refresh the page, and then we try to look that up. What we would get in return is our invalid token message. And so if I refresh this, what I would get in return is a successful object. And so that is how you authenticate with tokens, at least after you've received the token. Again, that would be a little bit more advanced of a step to complete the first step in dynamically generating a token through a fetch operation.